So we are continuing the module on Towards Your Praxis, and this lecture is entitled Anthropological Practice and Employment. So if you've been following the discussion, we're kind of building off the idea of practice that we introduced in the last lecture. And kind of put simply, we can think of the idea of practice as what we do with the anthropological knowledge and education we gain in the university, what we apply it to, right, beyond simply academic kinds of concerns. You see the Chekhov quote here, knowledge is of no value unless you put it into practice, which is a truism, if you will. Of course, knowledge does have a value, knowledge for knowledge's sake. But the idea is that we traditionally have overemphasized knowledge for knowledge's sake. Kind of what, if you think back to Boaz, what he referred to as the curiosities, right? People are just simply interested in something because it's interesting, rather than, let's say, what it does for the world, what it does for communities, what it does for human beings, and so on. And so, kind of putting this quote in here just to kind of remind us of the sort of historical overemphasis on kind of pure knowledge or theoretical knowledge, as opposed to the idea of practice or praxis. And I think when we begin to think about Towards Your Praxis and what you do after graduation, it's one of the reasons why I was asking you to think about your identities and asked you the question of sort of who you are. Because when it comes down to practice, really understanding your own needs and desires is very important. And I don't mean that just in an individualistic sense of like you as an individual and your needs and desires. You have kind of your personal needs and desires, but you also have social needs and desires that reflect your social being, right? The communities that you're a part of and so on. There are many ways to practice anthropology, and we don't necessarily have to think of employment as practice. But employment is a kind of way to practice anthropology. And so asking you sort of in this lecture and in this module to think about the kind of work that you want to do after you graduate. Is there a way that you can practice anthropology, right, as a form of employment or a form of work? What would be your ideal career? How does anthropology inform it? These are the kinds of questions that we're thinking about in this particular lecture. You've been very focused on grades and grade point averages. You've been very focused on things like course assignments and so on. You've been focused probably this last year on degree requirements and finishing those up. But what about beyond that? When you came to anthropology, what is it that you wanted to achieve beyond those sort of practical and pragmatic kinds of features of studying anthropology in the university? What is it that you felt like anthropology might help you to achieve? As you started thinking about your graduation, you start thinking about employment options, let's say, what kind of organizations might you like to work with? And this can be, I mean, we definitely see a lot of our students who end up taking any job that they can because they need a job. Any job that pays a sort of livable wage, they will take that. And sometimes they feel like they can't practice anthropology because of those kind of financial constraints. But it really, I want to kind of re-emphasize this, that practicing anthropology does not entail simply having a form of employment or a career that's identifiably like practicing anthropology. You can be working a job to pay your bills and to subsist while practicing anthropology in a volunteer capacity in your life. That is a reality. I think the ideal for our program is to help you achieve a kind of employment or career in which you can practice anthropology. I think that is a goal, but it's not necessarily the end of all anthropological practice, something to consider. So we are thinking about the notion of employment. This lecture is moving towards this idea of employment as a kind of anthropological practice, right? The way that anthropology is sort of out in the world. And sometimes that entails a neat job description that includes the word anthropology, like forensic anthropologist, as you see listed here in a job description. But it can be something like sociocultural researcher or any of the other myriad different kinds of work that anthropological knowledge is useful for. And there are lots of different web-based search platforms that if you are exploring or you want to explore, you may have already explored these. I hope you've already explored these. Hopefully there's maybe something new you hadn't considered in the past. I think good job search kinds of search platforms include idealist.org, really good if you have interest in things like social advocacy, for example, very good site for looking for forms of employment. LinkedIn, which I think has really become much better through time for not only, let's say, job advertisements, but just looking at careers and different potentials in terms of employment. The kinds of discussions you see on LinkedIn, I think, are quite valuable. Monster Jobs, which is an older web-based search platform for employment, but still is quite significant. In fact, the two positions here are from Monster itself. Shovel Bums, for the archaeologists among us, is a classic site that many people utilize for their kind of entry into the world of employment in archaeology. And then those interested in governmental work and public service, you have the USA Jobs, which cross many of the different subfields of anthropology. I think if you're reflecting on the idea of practicing anthropology and you're graduating, that finding a job is one of the ways you can think about this kind of practice, right? You may not be doing something that's identifiably anthropology, but you're applying it and you're putting it into practice. And so searching through these different websites, finding different kinds of jobs that interest you, finding different kinds of organizations that may interest you, and then reaching out and opening a line of dialogue with these is really essential. So maybe you only will reach out to an organization when there's a job listed, let's say, and you should. You can always get more information than any of these job listings are going to have. But it's also important for you to begin to establish contact with the area, right, of the job market that you have an interest in. To, when you see interesting jobs, to reach out and talk with some of these organizations about their needs, about what they're looking for. Because I think you can grow, right, your experience in these areas. Let's say it's human services that you're thinking you're going to do your practice in. And so you start searching for jobs in human services. Well, the term human services isn't used very widely in the undergraduate course curriculum, let's say. And so one of the ways to learn about it is to begin to move beyond the kind of the academic work that you've been doing to actually start to reach out, to make contacts, to talk with people, to ask questions, and to start learning on your own about that area, right, that you are interested in working in, volunteering in, becoming more involved in. In addition to sort of thinking about the job search methods, using online job search engines, starting to think about the ways that you can gain more information about jobs, kind of contacting organizations and so on. I think another key thing to think about is developing that resume and potentially a portfolio as well. So a resume, most of you have, you're going to want to have your personal data, your education, your job history, outside activities. Hopefully you've all been volunteering your time and gaining practical real-world experience beyond your coursework. I know we emphasize this and not everyone sort of takes us up on this, but that's going to be essential for you in a very competitive job market to show people your value, your importance, your significance, what it is, you represent for them beyond just your education. But the education is important, obviously, and one of the things that we see that tends to be kind of weak, if you will, and why we're pointing it out now in this particular lecture, is that you want to kind of convert your coursework experience, the different classes that you have taken, maybe the different topical interests in anthropology, different methodological interests in anthropology, different theoretical interests in anthropology, let's say, that will have maybe the direct limited applicability in a way. You want to convert that, right, into the knowledge and skills that are relevant for the jobs in question that you're interested in. There's this kind of translation of anthropology that needs to occur in practice. And so I'm just doing some really basics here because it really will vary for each and every student depending on who you are, what your needs and desires are, what the organizations in the area of the job market that you're looking at is. But to take those classes and take your knowledge and then really translate it into skill, that you have education in learned behavior as a key to understanding human populations, that you are trained in data-driven, inductive reasoning based on observation, that you have developed a holistic, comparative, big picture approach to human problems and solutions and so on. And this kind of translation is really essential. As you may have encountered in anthropology, it isn't taught in K through 12, and that is a problem that we are working on. We're hoping that many practitioners of anthropology decide to bring anthropology to K through 12, but in fact we don't have that now. And so you may very well be dealing with people that only have a tangential understanding of anthropology. And so it's not their responsibility to make the education you've gained relevant to them. That's your job. Your job is to do that translation where you're looking at jobs, right? And you're looking at the requirements, looking at the needs for that job. And then on the other hand, you're thinking about your education in anthropology, the classes, the coursework you've taken, and you're trying to make connections between them. How your education allows you to meet the requirements of a particular kind of job. Now, this definitely still applies on the resume to things like your outside activities. So let's say, for example, you were interested in cultural diversity in late industrial societies, you're interested in immigration and immigration issues, and you've volunteered at a immigration services non-governmental organization in the Spokane area. Well, absolutely, you also want to translate not only your education, that you've had a class, let's say, on immigration, you've had a class on cultural anthropology and so on, but you also want to tie that in with your motivation, your experience, right, in this particular kind of non-governmental organization, this particular kind of community organization. You want to kind of tie them together in the resume in a way that sort of tells a coherent narrative of you, your value, your significance, and why you are the right person for that particular job. Matching your skills with the job requirements is really, really essential. So here's just from the first job advertisement in a previous slide. You see they will list those minimum requirements. They'll talk about the kinds of degrees that they're looking for. They'll talk about the kinds of knowledge that they are interested in their employees in having. They'll mention things like experience and so on. They may even mention experience of familiarity with particular kinds of equipment, particular kinds of software or hardware and so on. And when you are putting together the resume for the specific job that you're interested in, you want to make it really, really clear the connections across what you have as your identity, as your job history, your education, your volunteering, and so on, and those particular kinds of requirements. You see they ask for knowledge, skills, and abilities, and you have things like different software packages or applications. You have a demonstrated history of initiative or achievement, so things you yourself began, projects that you started, things that you've achieved. If you've managed to achieve an award while here studying at EW, you want to highlight all of that. You want to really take this very serious, not kind of do a cursory glance at the requirements or the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities, but you want to take the time and design a resume or a portfolio, a resume, let's say, and published articles that you have, potentially a website that you have, a blog, a podcast. If you volunteered to manage the department's Instagram account, right, that can be included in your portfolio of materials that you have achieved, that you've done, that showcase, right, your skills and your knowledge. And there are a lot of ways to kind of frame this. Things like you may have volunteered while in university as you're studying culture, with different various cultural groups. Maybe you got involved with international students on campus. And so cross-cultural experience where you didn't just have a class and study something, but you went beyond that, right? And you got involved. You have those kind of experience that you can tie, right, with your education. This is essential in really achieving a highly meaningful career. You have done a lot of writing in college, and you've learned to communicate, right, about complex kinds of issues and problems. And so you have, as a result of your BA, developed quite extensive communication skills. And you can see that is something that they're looking for here. If you attach to a resume, you build a portfolio, you can include one of, let's say, the best, the most stellar paper that you've written. If it's a research proposal, maybe they have grant writing as one of the skills that they're looking for, and you can include one of the proposals that you developed, right, for your coursework. Research skills, maybe you did a research paper for one of your classes, and research skills is part of the kinds of requirements or the skills that they're looking for. You can include that and again attach that paper as part of a portfolio that you showcase yourself and your skills and your knowledge, right, to a potential employer. If you've had something that's we can call a project, where you've had a complex research endeavor that has entailed things like literature review, it's included things like research with human subjects, right? Well, that's project management. That's going beyond simply a research paper to something bigger. And you want to highlight that rather than, let's say, kind of burying it in things, burying it in just the final outcome of a research paper, for example. You don't want to do that. You want to actually show your achievements, because I know not every single student can actually manage a project like that, from developing a question, developing a hypothesis, doing a literature review, and then actually designing a project with methods and human subjects and writing that up. So if that's something that's part of your educational experience, as part of your BA, you do want to highlight that. You want to include that as part of the portfolio. Leadership and teamwork, right? You see that here as well. So there are students in our community that have kind of stepped ahead, let's say, of majors as a whole, and they've become leaders. They've dialogued with faculty, they've provided feedback when faculty have asked for it, and that's very important. That's not something you want to de-emphasize. If you have had some leadership, whether that's in our department, whether it's been, let's say, the Associated Students of EWU, you've gotten involved in student politics, no matter what that leadership is, you want to wrap that into this part of putting together your resume and your portfolio. It's very, very important. You know, as the competition for kind of meaningful jobs that anthropology is relevant for, well, this becomes more and more important. You can't just depend upon the fact that you have an anthropology BA. Now it's sort of incumbent on you to show people what that means, why it's significant, why not only the anthropology BA, but you in particular, you as the motivated person that's been a leader, you as the person who's gone and done a project, You as a person that potentially, let's say, maybe it's not leadership, but you're a team player, right? You're an important part of a team, and you can demonstrate that either through work that you've done. So I'm thinking of somebody that's done a women's group on campus, and so they weren't a particular leader for it, but they were an important member of the women's group. This is the kind of stuff that you really want to include in your resume. You want to make these kinds of skills that you have particularly clear. For this particular job in question, you see, able to work well independently as well as a team environment, right? And so you need to, in the resume, in the portfolio you put together, you need to address each of the needs that that particular job is looking for. You want to show how, the evidence, if you will, for how you can work independently. That is, let's say, this pandemic and the asynchronous courses that ask you to meet the deadlines and ask you to complete the work, complete the readings, and so on. Here's an example, right, of working well independently, online learning environment that you've been successful in. It may be the team environment, right, that you're going to emphasize things I was talking about earlier, like the student that was involved in putting together a women's group on campus. Language skills. So at university, you have the opportunity, well, you have the requirement as part of your BA to have 2 years of a foreign language. And as anthropologists, knowing the importance of language, you've probably gone on and you've taken a language like Japanese or French and so on, and you want to highlight that as well, because ability to become proficient in a language translates into lots of different kinds of cognitive skills. And so, again, you want to emphasize these if you have them. Don't bury them, if you will, make them invisible on your resume or in that portfolio, but really highlight them. If you have an essay that you wrote in Japanese or an essay that you wrote in French, include that in your portfolio. Maybe you have a grant proposal, a research grant proposal that you can include. Maybe you have a short essay. It doesn't have to be, a long research paper in a second language. If you did even something in a short 1 to 2 page kind of format that shows your abilities in another language, you are able to communicate to the organization or to the employer, right, your broader value, your broader significance, the broader importance, right, that you might have in their organization. So we kind of talked a little bit about just practicing anthropology, getting out beyond the university, thinking of this in one possible way, which is employment, putting together a resume, doing job searches, starting to find what it is they're looking for, what skills they're actually looking for, highlighting those on your resume or your portfolio here. The resume is accompanied, right, by this box of materials, the portfolio, that can be shown to potential employers and really sets someone apart, particularly if the portfolio is of a very high quality. If you've taken the work that you've done in school very seriously, and you actually have examples of high quality scholarship, I mean, this is the place to put it. This is the interview. So let's say you have the resume and you've really did a good job tying it to the job and showcasing your skills and so on. You get your foot in the door in terms of getting an interview. Then it's kind of presenting yourself in a similar way. Highlighting again what you have done, what the relationship of anthropology is to all this, because you really are highlighting this BA, absolutely. There is a reason that people have encouraged you to do 4 years of higher ed, and it is going to be a high point of your resume, a high point of what you have to offer, and it's incumbent on you to take the time to prepare to be able to tell people what the value of anthropology, what the value of your anthropological training will be. What is your comparative advantage? So I have kind of on here, selling them on anthropology. Well, a lot of jobs are going to have some background with social sciences, and they're going to have a little bit of familiarity with fields like anthropology, social work, sociology, and so on. But the people looking at your portfolio may not be as familiar as you imagine they are with anthropology. And so, why did you study anthropology? Why, with your anthropological training, right, are you applying for this job? Can you communicate that to them? Can you tell them why anthropology provides a better preparation and training for the job in question than other fields, other comparable kinds of fields? What about your training? What about your experience? What you have done personally with that training makes you a really unique candidate. So if putting these things together of having volunteered and gotten involved in leading in our department as a student, and putting all of this together, right, to show how you're a very unique and strong candidate for employment, selling them on anthropology, I mean, it's really, really important. If the two people that are interviewing you don't understand what anthropology is, and you can't make a clear, short, succinct statement on what anthropology is and why it has trained you to be able to do the job well, it's likely that the interview will not be successful. They may simply not know anything about it, and if you don't do that work for them, they are going to have an incomplete understanding of your role in their organization, your role for them as an institution. So to kind of conclude here, just moving beyond practice, maybe in conceptual terms, kind of comparing practice to theory being a detached, objective kind of reflection on things, whereas practice is sort of not that detached knowledge, abstract knowledge, but techniques, right? Knowledge that becomes simultaneous with activity and action in the world. There's kind of classical understanding of what practice is, and really thinking about that in terms of the potential jobs that you're doing in the world. We talked about how kind of all of this kind of comes together around things like the resume, in bringing that abstract education or abstract knowledge into play, into a kind of wisdom that people can recognize that will be applicable to the kinds of activities they're involved in, social service provision, for example. And I think as a final departing point for the lecture is to really think about the resources you have at Eastern. You have a career center in which you can get direct feedback on things like your resume, on things like a job cover letter. You can get feedback and information about things like job searches and so on. And I really do want to underscore that not only am I available to you for these kinds of things, not only do you have an assignment, right, but that I'm here also to give you feedback on things like your resume and your cover letters and so on, but that there's actually an office on campus that is focused and specializes on this. Please make use of that resource. Have me look at your materials. Have them look at your materials. Get as many eyes on those materials before you place them in the hands of a potential employer.